Understanding money as a divine idea also eliminates guilt and shame around wealth. Many people carry unconscious beliefs that money is evil, that wealth corrupts, or that good people should be poor. But money itself is neutral, neither good nor evil. The consciousness of the person using it determines its effect. In the hands of love, money heals, builds, blesses, and transforms. In the hands of wisdom, it multiplies and creates even greater good. In the hands of service, it becomes a tool for blessing multitudes. Money amplifies the character of its possessor. If you are good-hearted, money makes you more capable of good. This understanding transforms how you handle money at every level. You treat each dollar with respect, not fear. You bless every transaction, whether giving or receiving. You handle money with gratitude, knowing that appreciation multiplies whatever it touches. Money also responds to your emotions and intentions. Money handled with fear contracts and resists flow. Money handled with gratitude expands and multiplies. Money released with joy returns with compound interest. Money blessed with appreciation brings even greater blessings. The wealthy understand these principles intuitively. They treat money as a friend, not an enemy. They circulate it freely rather than hoarding it fearfully. They invest it wisely rather than spending it carelessly. They appreciate it genuinely rather than taking it for granted. Money is also a symbol of trust. Trust that value will be honored, that exchange will continue, that provision exists. All commerce functions on this foundation of trust. When you declare your wealth, you're exercising ultimate trust in the invisible supply that backs all monetary exchange. In the higher spiritual realm, money represents divine substance taking temporary form for purposes of exchange and circulation. This substance is eternal and inexhaustible. The forms may change, coins, bills, digital transfers, but the essence remains constant and unlimited. Gratitude is the golden key that unlocks every blessing and the spiritual magnet that draws infinite abundance into your experience. It is not a polite afterthought or a casual thank you. It is a dynamic force that literally restructures reality around you. When you say, "Thank you that I am a multi-millionaire from today," you're not waiting for proof to be grateful. You're being grateful for proof that's already secured in the invisible realm. This kind of gratitude before manifestation, is the highest form of faith and the fastest way to materialize desires. True gratitude operates on the principle of multiplication. Whatever you appreciate, appreciates. Whatever you bless, increases. Whatever you thank for, expands. This is not just positive thinking. This is spiritual law in operation. Gratitude transforms the very molecular structure of your experience. Scientists have discovered that gratitude actually changes brain chemistry, creating new neural pathways that support abundance consciousness. But beyond the physical effects, gratitude creates energetic changes that alter your magnetic field. When you live in constant appreciation, you become a magnet for more experiences to appreciate. The universe responds to gratitude by providing more reasons to be grateful. This creates an upward spiral of ever-increasing blessings. Gratitude also transforms the energy of money itself. Money that is appreciated multiplies. Money that is blessed increases. Money that is thanked returns with friends. Every act of genuine appreciation sends a signal to the universe that says, "Send me more of this." The practice of gratitude should permeate every aspect of your financial life. Be grateful for every penny that comes your way. Appreciate every opportunity to spend money on things you value. Thank every person who pays you for your services. Bless every investment that grows your wealth. Gratitude is also the antidote to fear and lack consciousness. It's impossible to feel truly grateful and experience anxiety at the same time. When you focus on appreciating what you have, you naturally shift out of focusing on what you lack. Most people wait for blessings to appear before they give thanks, but this reverses the proper spiritual order. Gratitude creates the magnetic field that pulls blessings into manifestation. The more grateful you are before you see evidence, the faster evidence appears. Gratitude also programs your subconscious mind with abundance patterns. When you feel grateful for wealth, your subconscious registers wealth as your reality and begins reorganizing your entire life to match that internal programming. Every feeling of appreciation is a command to your deeper mind. This is my truth. Multiply it. Living in gratitude means appreciating not just the millions you're claiming, but every small blessing along the way. The person who is grateful for pennies opens the channel for dollars. The person who appreciates current income, however modest, prepares the way for greater income. Gratitude creates an atmosphere where miracles become natural. You begin noticing opportunities others miss, receiving ideas others don't get, and attracting circumstances others can't explain. Grateful people live in a different world. A world where abundance is normal and lack is foreign. The energy of gratitude also attracts generous people into your life. Like attracts like. So when you operate from appreciation, you draw other appreciative, generous souls who become channels for your continued blessing. Being a multi-millionaire from today means more than having money in the bank. It means embodying the consciousness of abundance in every fiber of your being. You think like wealth, speak like wealth, act like wealth, and radiate wealth from your very presence. This embodiment is not pretense or fake it till you make it. It's the natural expression of knowing who you truly are at the deepest level. When you recognize yourself as a child of infinite supply, abundance becomes as natural as breathing. Consciousness is the determining factor in all manifestation. Your outer world is always a reflection of your inner world. Change the consciousness, and the circumstances must change. This is why working on wealth consciousness is more important than working on wealth strategies. Millionaire consciousness begins with identity. You must see yourself as wealthy before you can become wealthy in external form. This identity shift happens through consistent practice of affirming, visualizing, and embodying your wealthy self. This consciousness shows up in how you carry yourself. There's a quiet confidence, an unshakable peace, an expectant joy that comes from knowing you are provided for by infinite supply. Others sense this energy and are naturally drawn to you, creating opportunities and connections that accelerate your manifestation. Wealth consciousness is reflected in every decision you make. You choose quality because you understand value. You invest in yourself because you know you're worth the investment. You give generously because you understand that giving multiplies receiving. Embodying wealth means making decisions from abundance, not scarcity. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" you ask, "Is this worthy of my investment?" Instead of operating from fear of loss, you operate from expectation of increase. Instead of hoarding resources, you circulate them wisely. This consciousness also influences how you speak about money and wealth. You never say you're broke, even if your bank account is empty. You never complain about bills, even when they're challenging. You never speak lack into your experience through careless words. Instead, you consistently affirm your wealth. You speak of money flowing to you easily. You describe opportunities appearing constantly. You declare prosperity as your natural state. Your words become prophetic, creating the reality they describe. Millionaire consciousness includes having a prosperity mindset about all areas of life, not just money. You expect the best outcomes. You look for opportunities in every situation. You see abundance everywhere, in nature, in relationships, in possibilities. This way of being creates what appears to be miraculous results. The right people show up at the right time. Unexpected opportunities arise. Resources appear just when needed. Ideas surface that solve financial challenges. But these aren't coincidences. They're the natural result of living from wealth consciousness. Wealthy consciousness also means taking responsibility for your financial results without blame or excuses. You understand that your consciousness created your current situation, and your consciousness can create a new situation. This empowers you to change rather than making you a victim of circumstances. Many people inherit poverty consciousness like they inherit physical traits, automatically and unconsciously. Generations of family members may have struggled financially, creating invisible beliefs about money being hard to get, good people being poor, or wealth being somehow wrong or corrupting. These generational patterns create what spiritual teachers call familiar spirits. Repeating patterns that feel normal and comfortable, even when they're destructive. Your family may have a spirit of poverty, struggle, or just getting by that has operated for generations. When you declare, "I am a multi-millionaire from today," you're not just changing your own life, you're breaking generational curses and establishing new patterns for everyone connected to you. You become the one who shifts your entire family lineage from lack to abundance. These inherited patterns often operate below conscious awareness. You may find yourself sabotaging financial opportunities, feeling guilty about success, or unconsciously recreating your parents' financial struggles. The first step to freedom is recognizing these patterns and their origins. Common generational money patterns include beliefs like, money doesn't grow on trees, rich people are greedy, who can't afford that, money is the root of all evil, or good people struggle financially. These beliefs, repeated generation after generation, create invisible barriers to wealth. Breaking these patterns requires more than positive thinking. It requires spiritual intervention. You must consciously reject the familiar spirit of poverty and invite the spirit of abundance to take its place. This happens through consistent declaration of new truth about your financial identity. The beautiful truth is that you have the power to change, not just your own financial destiny, but your family's entire relationship with money. Your success creates new possibilities for your children, new expectations for your relatives, and new evidence that abundance is achievable for people like you. This transformation often brings up resistance, both from within yourself and from others. Family members may question your new attitudes about money. Friends might feel uncomfortable with your changing relationship with wealth. This resistance is normal and temporary. Your commitment to truth must be stronger than your need for approval. Remember that you're not just changing your own life. You're becoming an example of what's possible. Your wealth consciousness gives others permission to claim their own abundance. The process of breaking generational patterns also involves forgiveness. Forgiving previous generations for the limitations they passed down, and forgiving yourself for accepting those limitations. This forgiveness clears the energetic pathway for new patterns to establish. As you consistently live from wealth consciousness, you begin to attract family members and friends who support your new identity. The universe will surround you with people who celebrate your success rather than resent it. Divine law contains a magnificent principle that governs all increase. Whatever you appreciate appreciates, whatever you bless multiplies, whatever you are grateful for expands. This multiplication principle is why understanding spiritual law creates compound results that seem miraculous to those who don't understand the laws governing them. The multiplication principle operates like compound interest in the financial world. Just as money invested wisely grows exponentially over time, consciousness invested in truth creates exponentially increasing results in all areas of life. When you sincerely appreciate the money you have, whether it's $10 or $10,000, that money becomes a seed that produces more money. When you bless your current income, even if it seems small, that income becomes a launching pad for greater income. Appreciation activates multiplication. This is why it's crucial to be genuinely grateful for your current financial situation, while simultaneously declaring your greater wealth. You don't need to pretend you're satisfied with less than you desire. but you do need to appreciate what you currently have as the foundation for what's coming. The multiplication principle also works with your declarations. Each time you say, "I am a multi-millionaire from today," you plant a seed in consciousness. With consistency, these seeds multiply exponentially, creating momentum that becomes unstoppable. Your words compound like interest, building power with each repetition. Understanding multiplication changes how you handle every financial blessing, no matter how small. A found penny is not just money. It's evidence of the principle working in your life. A small windfall is not just extra cash. It's confirmation that increase is your natural experience. A raise is not just higher income. It's the universe demonstrating its desire to bless you. The multiplication principle operates through the law of attraction. Like attracts like, so when you consistently focus on and appreciate abundance, you attract more abundance. When you bless money, you attract more money to bless. When you celebrate wealth, you attract more wealth to celebrate. This principle also applies to your service to others. The more value you provide to people, the more money flows back to you. But this isn't just about working harder. It's about appreciating the opportunity to serve and blessing the value you provide. Multiplication consciousness sees every financial transaction as an opportunity for increase. When you spend money, you bless it to multiply in the hands of the receiver and return to you increased. When you receive money, you appreciate it as evidence of multiplication in action. While faith eliminates the illusion of delay, divine timing ensures that everything unfolds in perfect order for your highest good and the greatest benefit of all involved. Your millions are not late. They're arriving at exactly the right moment when you're prepared to receive them and use them wisely. Divine timing coordinates countless moving parts that human understanding cannot fully grasp. People must be positioned in the right places. Circumstances must align perfectly. Opportunities must be created and presented at optimal moments. Your consciousness must be prepared to receive and steward great wealth responsibly. This orchestration happens automatically when you maintain your declaration and trust the process. The same intelligence that coordinates the movement of planets and the changing of seasons is coordinating the manifestation of your wealth. You don't need to figure out the timing. You only need to stay aligned with truth. Sometimes what appears as delay is actually divine protection, preventing you from receiving something before you're ready to handle it properly. Receiving great wealth before developing the consciousness to maintain it often results in the wealth disappearing as quickly as it came. Sometimes the seeming wait is preparation time. Developing your character, expanding your understanding, building your capacity to receive and manage larger amounts of money. This preparation ensures that when your millions manifest, you're ready to multiply them rather than lose them. Divine timing also considers the impact of your wealth on others. Your prosperity may be timed to coincide with opportunities to bless family members, support worthy causes, or fund important projects that serve the greater good. The key is to remain consistent regardless of appearances. Don't let temporary circumstances weaken your faith or change your declarations. Divine timing often works in ways that seem delayed from human perspective, but are perfectly orchestrated from spiritual perspective. Trust the process completely while maintaining your part of the agreement. Your part is to declare truth, live from wealth consciousness, practice gratitude, and prepare to receive. The universe's part is to arrange all circumstances for manifestation. When divine timing reaches its perfect moment, things happen rapidly. Years of seeming preparation can culminate in sudden breakthrough. This is why it's important to stay ready and maintain expectancy, even when external progress seems slow. As we reach the culmination of this transformative journey, through the laws of supernatural wealth, understand that you are no longer the same person who began reading these words. Your consciousness has been fundamentally shifted, your understanding permanently expanded, and your spiritual DNA activated for unprecedented abundance. The knowledge you now possess is not theoretical. It is practical, powerful, and proven. You now understand that your words create your reality through the fundamental creative force of the universe. You know that infinite supply exists in the invisible realm, waiting for your recognition and command. You've learned that faith eliminates all barriers of time and circumstance. You understand money as a sacred divine idea, rather than material limitation. You've discovered that gratitude is the golden key that multiplies every blessing. Most importantly, you now know beyond any doubt that you are already wealthy in the spiritual realm. And from this moment forward, it's simply a matter of allowing that eternal truth to manifest in perfect physical form. The transformation you've experienced through these truths is permanent. You cannot know what you now know. You cannot return to the limited thinking that once bound you. You have crossed over from poverty consciousness into wealth consciousness, from lack mentality into abundance reality. From this moment forward, let every breath you take affirm your divine prosperity. Let every step you walk declare your supernatural abundance. Let every thought you think confirm your millionaire reality. You are one with infinite supply. You are wealthy by divine decree. You are prosperous by eternal law. Walk in this truth daily with unwavering conviction. Live from this knowing consistently with joyful expectation. Speak from this certainty boldly with grateful appreciation. Your millions are not approaching from some distant future. They are here now, in the invisible realm of infinite supply, waiting for your complete acceptance and joyful reception. Stand up in this sacred moment and declare with absolute, unshakable conviction, I am a multi-millionaire from today and forever. My wealth is established in heaven and manifests perfectly on earth. I receive my divine inheritance, now with overflowing gratitude and supernatural joy. The infinite supply flows through me as unlimited abundance every moment of every day. Every channel of prosperity is permanently open to me. Every door of opportunity swings wide before me continuously. I am wealthy, I am prosperous, I am abundantly blessed. And so it is established in the name of truth, now and forever throughout eternity. Your millionaire life has officially begun in this holy moment. Welcome to your new eternal reality of unlimited, supernatural abundance that can never be diminished, never be depleted, and never be denied. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to attract money effortlessly, while others struggle their entire lives, working harder and harder, but never breaking free from financial limitations? Have you ever questioned why certain individuals can manifest millions seemingly out of thin air, while others with the same education, background, and opportunities remain trapped in cycles of just getting by? The answer lies not in what they do differently, but in what they understand about the invisible laws that govern wealth creation. Today, I'm going to share with you the exact spiritual principle that transformed my relationship with money forever. This isn't about positive thinking, visualization techniques, or manifestation tricks you've heard before. This is about a divine law so powerful that when properly applied, it literally reorganizes the universe around you to deliver abundance beyond your wildest dreams. Before we dive deep into this life-changing truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up if you're ready for your financial breakthrough, and comment below with ELTHISMINN. Because what you're about to discover will shift everything you thought you knew about money, prosperity, and your divine right to abundance. In the very beginning, before anything existed in physical form, there was the Word. And this Word was not merely sound or vibration. It was pure creative force, the fundamental power that spoke entire universes into existence. This same creative force lives within you right now, waiting to be activated through your spoken declarations. When you understand that your words carry the same creative authority that formed galaxies, parted seas, and raised the dead, everything changes. Your voice becomes an instrument of divine power. Your declarations become royal decrees that command reality to shift and align with your truth. The statement, "I am a multi-millionaire from today," is not a wish, a hope, or a positive affirmation. It is a spiritual law being set into motion. It is a divine command that activates every force in heaven and earth to bring about its fulfillment. Every syllable contains creative power. Every word plants a seed in the fertile soil of infinite possibility. Most people fail to experience true wealth because they misunderstand the power of their own voice. They speak casually about money, complaining about bills, worrying about expenses, declaring themselves broke or struggling. And the universe, which is always listening and always responding, simply delivers exactly what they've spoken. The human tongue has been given dominion over circumstances, situations, and conditions. It is the rudder that steers the ship of your life. It is the key that unlocks every door of opportunity. It is the brush that paints the canvas of your experience. Yet most people use this incredible power carelessly, creating lack through their lack of understanding. But when you align your words with divine truth, when you speak from the place of your spiritual inheritance, rather than your temporary circumstances, miracles become natural. The invisible realm rushes to manifest whatever you decree with faith and authority. Your subconscious mind, that faithful servant of your soul, takes every word you speak as absolute law. It doesn't question, doesn't doubt, doesn't analyze. It simply accepts your declarations as instructions and begins reorganizing every aspect of your life to match what you've commanded. This reorganization happens at levels you cannot see or comprehend. Opportunities begin aligning. People start positioning themselves to serve your highest good. Circumstances rearrange themselves to create pathways for your prosperity. Resources mobilize to flow in your direction. All because you spoke a word in faith. The spoken word operates on frequencies that transcend physical limitations. Sound is vibration, and vibration is energy. When you consistently declare your wealth, you tune your entire being to the frequency of abundance. This frequency becomes a magnet, attracting people, opportunities, ideas, and resources that vibrate at the same level of prosperity. Every word you speak creates ripples in the invisible realm, like stones thrown into a still pond. These ripples expand outward, touching everything and everyone in their path, creating changes that eventually manifest as your physical reality. This is why the masters taught us to guard our tongues, as we would guard treasure. Think of a master sculptor who looks at a block of marble. While others see only stone, the artist sees the magnificent form hidden within, waiting to be revealed. With each strike of the chisel, guided by unwavering vision, the masterpiece emerges. Your declarations are the chisel strokes, and your wealth is the masterpiece waiting to be revealed. The consistency of your declarations determines the speed of your manifestation. Sporadic affirmations produce sporadic results. Consistent declarations create consistent flow. Daily commitment to your wealth affirmations creates daily movement toward your financial goals. Your word also carries emotional power. Words spoken with passion, conviction, and certainty carry far more creative force than words spoken mechanically or doubtfully. When you declare, "I am a multi-millionaire from today," with every fiber of your being believing it, the universe responds with equal intensity. Beyond the realm of physical appearances lies a dimension of reality that most people never discover. The invisible treasury of infinite supply. This is not a mystical fantasy or wishful thinking. This is the fundamental source from which all physical manifestation springs. In this invisible realm, there is no recession, no shortage, no economic downturn. There is only abundance, flowing eternally like a river that never runs dry. Every blessing you could ever desire, Every opportunity you could ever need, every channel of wealth you could ever imagine already exists in this treasury, in absolute perfection. This treasury exists in what spiritual teachers call the fourth dimension, the realm of causes rather than effects. The physical world is the world of effects, where we see the results of invisible causes. But the invisible treasury is pure cause, pure potential, pure creative possibility, waiting to be activated through human consciousness. When you declare, "I am a multi-millionaire from today," you're not asking the universe to create something new. You're acknowledging what already exists in the invisible storehouse and commanding it to take physical form in your experience. You're making a withdrawal from an account that has been established in your name since before the foundation of the world. Living from the invisible treasury means taking your eyes off appearances and fixing them firmly on truth. Your current bank account balance is temporary. Your present job income is changeable. Your existing circumstances are fluid. But the invisible treasury is eternal, unchanging, and inexhaustible. This treasury operates on completely different principles than the physical world. It knows no limitation, no boundary, no restriction. While others worry about market conditions, you rest in the assurance that your source transcends all temporary fluctuations. While others panic about economic uncertainty, you remain anchored in the certainty of infinite provision. The invisible treasury responds to recognition, not effort. You don't access it through struggle or strain, but through acknowledgement and acceptance. You don't earn your way into it through hard work, but claim it through understanding your divine inheritance. You don't manipulate it through clever techniques, but align with it through spiritual truth. Every millionaire, whether they realize it or not, has tapped into this invisible treasury. The difference between those who access it consciously and those who stumble upon it accidentally is understanding the laws that govern its operation. Conscious access creates sustainable wealth. Accidental access creates temporary fortune that often disappears as quickly as it came. The key to accessing this treasury is understanding that it's accessed through faith, not effort. Faith is the currency of the invisible realm. Just as physical money is the currency of the physical realm, faith is what you use to make transactions in the spiritual dimension. Every time you affirm your wealth, you're making a spiritual transaction with this invisible bank. Every time you speak abundance, you're transferring riches from the unseen to the seen realm. Every time you declare your prosperity, you're activating channels that existed before you were born. The invisible treasury is also governed by the law of circulation. Just as blood must flow through the body to maintain life, wealth must flow through your experience to multiply. Hoarding creates stagnation. Circulation creates multiplication. When you give freely from your treasury, knowing it's inexhaustible, more flows in to replace what flowed out, with increase. This understanding removes all anxiety about money. You no longer worry about having enough, because you know the source is infinite. You no longer fear loss because you understand that what is truly yours cannot be taken away. You no longer struggle for wealth, because you realize it's already secured in your divine account. The invisible treasury also contains all the wisdom you need to manage and multiply your wealth once it manifests. The ideas for investments, the strategies for growth, the connections for expansion. All of these exist in perfect form in this invisible realm, waiting for you to tune in and receive them. Faith is the invisible bridge that spans the gap between the world of spirit and the world of form. It is the divine force that draws tomorrow's blessings into today's experience, collapsing time and making the future present. Most people live trapped in the illusion of linear time, believing that wealth must come slowly, that financial breakthroughs require years of building, that abundance follows a long, difficult journey. But faith operates in the eternal now, where everything you desire already exists in completion. Faith sees through the eyes of spirit rather than the eyes of flesh. While physical sight shows you current limitations, spiritual sight shows you infinite possibilities. While natural vision focuses on what is, faith focuses on what can be. While human understanding operates in time, faith operates in eternity. When you declare, "I am a multi-millionaire from today," with unwavering faith, you're not setting a future goal. You're claiming a present reality. Faith sees the end from the beginning and knows that what is true in spirit is true now, regardless of what the physical senses report. Faith is the electricity that charges your declarations with manifesting power. Words without faith are empty echoes bouncing off the walls of limitation. Words infused with faith become creative lightning, restructuring reality wherever they strike. Faith transforms your voice from mere human speech into divine command. The quality of your faith determines the speed of your manifestation. Weak faith produces slow results. Strong faith produces rapid transformation. Perfect faith produces instantaneous miracles. This is why developing unwavering faith is crucial to experiencing supernatural wealth. Faith operates on the principle of substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. This means that faith itself becomes the substance of your wealth before it appears physically. Faith makes your millions real in the invisible realm, and from there, they must eventually manifest in the visible realm. The difference between those who manifest wealth quickly and those who struggle indefinitely is not talent, education, or opportunity, it's the quality of their faith. Weak faith says, "I hope this works." Strong faith says, "It is finished." Weak faith looks for evidence before believing. Strong faith believes until evidence appears. Faith also eliminates the burden of figuring out. The human mind wants to map out every step, control every detail, plan every move. But faith surrenders the how to divine intelligence and focuses only on the what. When you know with absolute certainty that you are wealthy, the universe arranges all circumstances necessary to prove it true. Consider a farmer who plants seeds in fertile soil. He doesn't dig them up daily to check their progress. He doesn't worry about exactly how they will grow. He plants with faith, waters with expectation, and trusts the invisible process of life to produce the harvest. Your declaration is the seed, your faith is the water, and your wealth is the inevitable harvest. Faith operates beyond the realm of five sense evidence. It sees what cannot be seen, knows what cannot be proven, and trusts what cannot be explained. This is why faith-filled people often appear foolish to the world. They speak of riches while surrounded by bills, declare abundance while experiencing lack, affirm prosperity while facing challenges. But faith is never foolish. It's simply operating from a higher law than appearances. Faith knows that the invisible is more real than the visible, that spiritual truth is more powerful than physical facts, that divine law supersedes human limitation. Faith also removes the element of time from manifestation. Time is a creation of the physical realm, but faith operates in the timeless dimension of spirit. In faith, your millions exist now. In faith, your prosperity is present. In faith, your abundance is current reality. The more you exercise faith, the stronger it becomes. Like a muscle that grows with use, your faith capacity expands each time you choose to believe despite contrary evidence. Each declaration made in faith builds momentum, creating an unstoppable force that must eventually manifest in physical form. Faith is also contagious. When others witness your unwavering faith in your prosperity, they begin to believe in possibilities they never imagined for themselves. Your faith creates faith in others, multiplying the positive energy around your manifestation. Money is not what most people think it is. It's not paper, metal, or digital numbers on a screen. These are merely symbols of something far more profound, a divine idea expressing itself as circulation, freedom, and abundant supply. Understanding money's true spiritual nature transforms your entire relationship with it. Instead of seeing money as scarce, limited, or difficult to obtain, you recognize it as an infinite idea flowing from an inexhaustible source. Instead of fearing money or feeling guilty about wanting it, you honor it as a sacred tool for divine expression. Money, in its purest essence, is crystallized energy, a physical manifestation of spiritual force. It represents the flow of value service, an exchange between human beings. When you provide value to others through your gifts, talents, or service, money flows back to you as a natural reflection of that exchange. As a divine idea, money is unlimited. Just as there is no shortage of love, wisdom, or creativity in the universe, there is no shortage of money. Scarcity is a human invention born from ignorance of spiritual law. The creator of infinite galaxies did not design a universe of lack for his children. The divine idea of money operates on the principle of circulation. Like the circulation of blood through the body or water through the earth, money must flow to fulfill its purpose. When circulation is free and unobstructed, health and abundance result. When circulation is blocked through fear, hoarding, or resistance, stagnation and lack appear. Money represents freedom. The freedom to choose, to express, to serve, to create. Divine intention has never been limited or constrained. The fields are clothed with beauty, the seas abound with life, the stars are scattered across endless skies. All creation demonstrates the nature of infinite abundance, and money is part of this infinite supply. When you declare, "I am a multi-millionaire from today," you're aligning yourself with this divine idea of infinite circulation. You're not taking from others. You're tapping into an unlimited supply that benefits everyone. Your wealth doesn't diminish others' opportunities, it creates more opportunities for all.